Okay, now, this morning we're in Deuteronomy 16, and we'll start at verse 18. But before we do that, I want to remind you of the outline of Deuteronomy. Because Deuteronomy, as I've said before, is a commentary on the Ten Commandments. And we're just starting Commandment 5. Okay? And I'd like to get an overview of this. Because it's not just honoring your parents, it's all the levels of authority over you. Okay.
Who added a boss, supervisor, whoever?
It's not listed here. We're studying Deuteronomy, not just general application.
Okay.
Okay, when we hit the sixth commandment in Deuteronomy, he deals with judges on a local level, lowest level of authority in your local town. Then, if they can't answer the question, you go to the priests and judges who are higher up than you. So you're probably going to make a trip to either a local big city, or you can go to Jerusalem. Okay, then it deals with the next level of authority, because Israel will one day have a king. And it describes what the king should be like, what he shouldn't be like, and then the authority of the priests and Levites is brought in. And then the prophet, the highest level of authority, is predicted. And this is a clear reference to the coming of Messiah, the second Moses. And then it deals with cities of refuge and how to deal with people who have innocently killed someone by mistake or by accident. Okay, can you see how this is just increasing levels of authority? Okay, the fifth commandment is honor your father and mother. That's the first level of authority, is the family. Okay, and above them is the judges, the courts, the king, the priest, the prophet. Okay, and it's an expanding level of authority that he's explaining. So when the commandment says honor your father and mother, it means all that. As we read this morning, what's the penalty for treating the judge or priest with contempt? Yeah, death. You just don't treat the judge as if he's nobody. Now, something that I noticed last night, I'd never actually seen this before because it sounded repetitious, but I started looking back to the chapters and it's not really repetitious. I'll read the paragraph starting in verse 18. Appoint judges and officials for each of your tribes in every town Yahweh your God is giving you, and you shall judge the people fairly. Do not pervert justice or show partiality. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the innocent. Follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land Yahweh your God has given you. What did Yeshua say was the first commandment with promise?
Honor your father and your mother.
Honor your father and mother. He says right here, establish justice, judges, so that you may live and possess the land.
Same chorus there.
Right, in the fifth commandment it says, so you may live long and go well in the land, or do well in the land. Okay, it's the same promise. Does that not clearly connect this as a commentary on the fifth commandment?
Very clear.
I would think so. But anyway, he says, don't pervert justice, don't go for bribes, and the purpose for it is so you may live long and possess the land. Usually when someone presents a bribe or tries to twist justice, what are they doing?
Well, they're trying to cheat.
Well, they're trying to prolong their life and have a better life.
Correct.
Okay, but that actually is the opposite of how you did that. Okay, you deal with things fairly, and that's how you have the long life and prosperity. If you're cheating to get ahead, you're not actually getting ahead. Now, something comes up here, and it comes up in this next paragraph. Do not set up a wooden Asherah pole beside the altar you build to Yahweh your God, and do not erect a sacred stone, for these Yahweh your God hates. Okay? In a theocracy, there's not freedom of religion. Okay, do we live in a theocracy?
No.
No.
Did the Puritans want us to live in a theocracy?
I think they did.
Yeah, they did, and that's what they were trying to set up. It didn't finally work out that way.
And that's what the Muslims want. They're trying to set up a theocracy.
Exactly. Church and state for them are the same thing. It's all part of the same deal. The idea of a democratic society like we have is not really a biblical idea. Okay? So sometimes the laws of Israel apply only in Israel, they don't apply outside of Israel.
Okay, we're
It
recording.
should be. There's nothing to do now.
Okay, now, it was interesting, I started doing some reading up on Baal and Asherah because they get mentioned together quite often. And this is the case where I'm going to advertise for the Archaeological Study Bible. Okay, they have a number of articles in there that have to do with archaeology. Of course, is why it's called the Archaeology Study Bible. I just thought I'd bring up a few points. In Hosea 2, they have an article on Baal and the fertility cults. Numbers 25, the narrative of Baal of Peor, showing the prominence of sacred prostitution within the cult. If you remember when Balaam goes to curse Israel and he can't, but he still wants some money, so he figures out a way to make Israel stumble. Because God can't curse Israel while they're being obedient. So he gets them to be disobedient. And half the tribe of Simeon is wiped out because that must be where the cult of prostitutes came down and went, ooh, come see us.
Send in
And-
the girls.
Yeah, they sent dancing girls out. And one of the things that they did was when they really wanted an answer to something, they used self-laceration for demonstrating devotion. Okay, and they just actually sit there and cut themselves. I mean, this is a bloody pagan cult.
Now they just tattoo themselves, some of them.
Well, think about this
Not
also.
every tattoo, but some of
Yeah.
them.
Think about this in Catholicism. In the Dark Ages, the priests would whip themselves. They would crawl up hundreds of steps on their knees. Okay, they would walk across broken glass. Okay, that's not a biblical practice. Nowhere in the Bible does God ask for anything more than sackcloth and ashes. Okay, or maybe fasting. Okay, it's not torture. It's not self-mutilation. Baal was associated with prosperity. And in Hosea 2, 16 and 17, it suggests that many people identified Baal with Yahweh almost as one and the same. And here's the problem. When you're so influenced by the dominant culture that people remain convinced that they were devout and orthodox followers of Yahweh when they were all the while worshiping Baal. Think about the confusion in the church today. Okay, the Reformation said, let's go back to Scripture. Okay, and from their mindset, from where they came from, they went back to Scripture. But they really only went back halfway. The Messianic way is going back the rest of the way. So when I say the next awakening will probably be a Messianic awakening, it will be another Reformation, but trying to go all the way back to Scripture, because now our minds are a little bit more open to the difference. I say a little bit more open. Because there's millions of people in the church who know the Sabbath and the commandments and about the feasts. Okay, I remember one rabbi that I knew, he said, I've been going to churches and talking about this for years, but nobody ever left. And the reason is, people are aware of it, but they're not willing to commit because they don't think that it's really a serious issue. Why? No one else is doing it.
Well, I think another problem too is there's not the synagogues or churches or whatever you want to label it in place for them to go to. Just as when you were being convinced of the Sabbath, you were in distress because where am I going to go? I have no place to meet. So I think that that's one of the problems with the people in the church who are coming to that understanding. They don't know where to go. They don't know what to do about it. Because as an individual, you can't just run off. I shouldn't say can't, but it's, you can't run off and start something all by your lonesome. just because of a lack of understanding. So as there's more congregations in place, then it's giving the people a place to go, just like what Ed is doing down in Geneva, you know, bringing people in.
Yeah.
And he's in the same position because they don't have a place to go on Shabbat.
Right.
And sometimes Shabbat, sometimes Sunday, because they can't get to
Well,
Shabbat anymore.
they've been meeting primarily on Sunday because they really only have a place to go one day a month on Shabbat. So I think that that's one of the biggest problems right now for the people who are coming to recognize that maybe we are supposed to be meeting on Shabbat. You know, maybe we are supposed to be keeping the feast. As the church is starting to open its eyes and look into these things, they need places to go.
Yeah, and that's why it's good if people know, somehow we can get it out there that we're here. As I said, I bet there's a lot of people in Daytona that would like to be here if they knew we existed.
Year by year, Christians, in numbers, I don't know, the large numbers that they go in, but year by year, there's this, you know, handful of Christians throughout the country that come to the realization, hey, this whole Christmas thing isn't biblical. Jesus wasn't born that day, and they sort of move out of observing Christmas instead of stepping away from Christmas, they said, let's look at what the Bible really says, and then you look at the Sabbath. And then start going over to a Jewish synagogue just because they know that's a Sabbath. They're God, you know, worshipers, and they gather on the Sabbath.
Yeah. Well, one of the other problems is pastors defending the whole thing. I mean, there's a lot of people in church that are raising questions up about the whole Christmas issue. And pastors will stand up and to pacify people, they'll just poo-poo it as, you know, this isn't a real issue. Okay? And I remember this debate going on 35 years ago. You know, I went to a Presbyterian church and they were talking about it. And if you can just say, well, it's okay, it's just a cultural thing, or, well, it's okay to just choose to create a holiday, even though we know Messiah wasn't born now. Still, we're celebrating his birth because, and here's the catchphrase, we don't know when he was born. Well, why? Because they don't know about the feasts. The church is dismally ignorant of the feasts, okay? And some Bible colleges and seminaries will actually take a little bit of time and say, well, yeah, Messiah did fulfill these feasts. They were a prophecy of him coming. And now that he's fulfilled them, they're done away with. And see, and that's where Matthew
Despite the
5
fact the Torah
totally
says
contradicts that.
forever.
Yeah, I know. Just because the Torah says it's forever, and here's what I got. That was an issue that came up every year, first year in Bible college. And they would say, oh, that forever just means for generations or for a long time. It doesn't mean forever. Okay, so if you say that, then people go, oh, okay. Well, that was for the dispensational age of the Jews. That's not for us today. And yet, it doesn't fit with Scripture.
To me, that brings up an issue of integrity of language
Yeah.
and how it was written originally, and the meaning of the scripture has not changed, but we've translated it through time and with our different reasons and abilities and whatever, we've actually changed what it means,
Well,
what it originally meant.
You know, continuing on with what you said though, with the change of language, even in our language, in the English language, you know, the words have been corrupted to
Like
mean
gay
something.
and
Yeah,
gay.
gay
Oh,
is
yeah.
one of
Oh, you're
the
right.
primary ones.
Sure.
So when you've got the change of definition in a language, then someone comes along, the young people, they come along and look at scripture and they're really baffled because they're inundated with the changes of language and don't comprehend what's going on there.
Right, like host. You know, you say a company of prophets or a host of you got
That's a good example.
a host of angels. Well, host meant army, captain of the host, captain of the armies. A friend of mine who's Catholic says, because they go up to really old language, he says he didn't get it. He's sitting in language, he's sitting in court, he's sitting in church and hearing this like the Lord of hosts is what is host? What are you talking about?
Right.
The guy who greets you at the door, what are you talking about?
Right, yeah.
And when I found out what it was, I explained it to him. He was happy as
Yeah,
pie to
right.
know, when I told them that.
They even call host the bread,
Right, yeah.
host.
Yeah, well, a number of words have a wide range of meaning, and you have to understand what they mean. But going back to Baal, Baal was usually found with a consort, like his wife. Okay, so Baal and Asherah are in the biblical times linked up together. Okay, and then there's also stories about how Baal dies in battle with Mot. You remember the Hebrew word mut, death? Well, Mot is death. He battles with death, and then with the help of his consort, he comes back to life. Okay, this is exactly what you find in the Babylonian religion. Nimrod is killed, and then he's reborn through his wife and comes back as a son, and their imagery is the mother holding the son, who's the reborn king. Okay, and then you look at the traditional imagery of Mary and son, and it's linked right there. And over the centuries, Mary has been climbing this ladder towards deity. Okay, they've actually come along and said she's born of a virgin, she was sinless, she ascended into heaven. Okay, this is just the Catholic Church reverting completely to the old Mithraism or Babylonian religion of the sun god.
It started on that premise.
Yeah.
Yeah, but nobody
they
came out and
decided to
said,
make Christmas take over the winter solstice. You know, the Festival of Lights, the big celebration. I mean, I'm enjoying keeping Winter Festival, but I'm not keeping Christmas.
Right.
Yeah. And it's been there, but it was in the shadows for a long time. But over the centuries, it's been officially recognized and stated. Okay? No, there's all kinds of things that go into that. We won't, but we won't.
Maintain our focus.
Anyway, you could also go into the Mesopotamian cult of Tammuz, which has a period of women weeping for Tammuz, 40 days weeping for Tammuz. You think about springtime and Lent. Okay, well, there's just a lot of compromise that's gone on. And the question is, the people who are doing this think that they are devout Christians who are honoring God.
Yeah.
And yet,
And I think God will keep that in mind at the day of judgment. The ones that are gonna be in deep doo-doo are the ones that knew better and taught them that.
Yeah.
right. And that's right. I mean, Matthew 10 and 11, when he talks about the judgment, the amount of light you have does reflect on how you'll be judged. And yet, they will be judged.
Yeah.
Okay, it says, come out from among them and be separate. And
Right.
for the most part, we're not doing it. And I learned most of what I knew from the church. Okay, and I learned most of what I had to unlearn from the church. So sometimes one is more than the other. Anyway, we're still dealing with, this is part of the fifth commandment, establishing judges for the purpose of setting up justice. And right after that, it comes up to this issue of don't erect an Asherah pole or a sacred stone to Baal. And I looked around in the archaeology Bible, I couldn't find a picture of a sacred stone to Baal. I don't know what it would look like. But it's forbidden. And notice what it says there. It says, God hates these. You know, when it says God hates something,
Better get it way away.
yeah, you really want to pay attention to that. Okay, and the question then becomes, what's the purpose of these judges? Well, the primary purpose of these judges was to keep these Asherah poles and Baal stones out of the country. That's why this next paragraph is in there. Now, here's the question that comes up also. If you have a change in God, God's established law, okay? What's right, what's wrong. If you have a change in God from Yahweh to Baal and Asherah, is there going to be a change in law?
Of course.
Yes.
Yes.
It has to be by definition.
Which by definition also means that what is justice is going to be changed.
Right.
The judges are told not to pervert justice, and then it says, don't let these false gods in. Well, it's not just because they're false gods, it's also because the false gods will pervert justice, because the value system in those pagan religions is radically different than the value system of Yahweh. When we did a tour over at the Historical Museum on the Egyptian exhibit, one of the things the guy brought out was to get into Egyptian heaven wasn't an issue of being good or bad. It was whether you were rich or not. Only the rich got in. Didn't matter how you got your riches, but you couldn't have a slummy neighborhood for an Egyptian heaven. So if you were rich, you got in. Didn't matter how many people you killed and stepped on along the way. If you were rich, you got into Egyptian heaven. And that's why the righteous thing in Egyptian was to be rich.
And it reminds me of a episode of whatever I was watching. It's a guy named Copeland. Kenneth Copeland was leading the message. He says, you know, he's always talking about getting rich, giving money, making money by giving money, routine. And he says, I heard someone come to me and say, you know, Pastor, I don't believe in all that prosperity message. I'd rather be poor and go to heaven than be rich and go to hell. He says, I turn that around and say, I'd rather be rich and go to heaven than be poor and go to hell.
Well, and I mean, think about this. In the first century, the Jews have got this off base because they're thinking if you're rich, it's a sign of God's blessing.
Yeah.
Okay.
They think that way.
How does Yeshua turn that on its head?
You can't serve God money.
Oh, you can't serve God money, okay. But the story of Lazarus dying of poverty at the door of the rich man, who then goes to hell while Lazarus goes to Abraham's bosom. Okay? It's not a hard and fast rule. The prosperity God sends, based on Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, is to the nation that follows him. It's not always individual. Okay? An individual might be righteous and be blessed, or an individual might be righteous and be just as poor as she can be. Think about Ruth and Naomi. Old Testament example. Okay, in the end of the story, they prospered. But she's righteous at the beginning of the story. Okay? There are lots of examples throughout Scripture of people who are devout and poor. Think about Elijah. Think about the prophets. Which one of the prophets retired rich to their home in Barbados or Cancun and sailed around on their yachts enjoying the beautiful girls and sun? None of them. Which of the apostles died rich? None of them. Okay, so when they say, well, you're poor, therefore God, you're not in favor with God, horse hockey.